I got Mr. Corla. First of all, Minister, with the announcement of, I think it's £1.5 billion, it's a lot of money, and a lot of people were interested to see how to be divvied out. And there is improvements in basically the planting grant for some, and on the yearly grant that the farmers get, the subsidy. What is worrying though out of the £1.5 billion is that for the ash dieback there doesn't seem to be a red cent for it, which is rather unusual because we have a problem with that needs to be rectified. And we talk about growing more and more, say, broadleafs, and we need to get farmers on board. The one worry I have though is that you're trying to promote forestry, and on the other side then you have the EU and the biggest land grab of all, trying to get 30% of the country basically re-wetted is what their agenda is. So if you add the forestry 18% and the 30% and throw in an odd lake and an odd river around the country, you probably have 50% of the country gone. And where does the word about food production come in as well? Because I think we need to think of people and about people making a living. I don't agree, and in fairness, a lot of the stuff he said was sound in my opinion, but I don't agree with the previous speaker that talked about how we'll be carbon farming. Like, forget about a community if you're carbon farming, for the simple reason it's abandonment. That's what it is. It's not going out driving in a sheep or a cow or a bullock or whatever. It's not that. It's going out, you don't have to be there, because all it is basically rewilding. That's what it is. So you don't have to be getting up at night, going out with a flash lamp, looking for a calf under a ditch or whatever. So I think we need to make sure, and I note when you said about planting, you talked about the south, the east. You didn't mention the west, but is the west being earmarked for this re-wetting? Because I'll tell you, there'll be no one forcing us in the west, EU or anybody, on this re-wetting thing, and they need to cop onto it, because for years our livelihood has been made out of shorting some of the land, and we, above all people, have contributed more in re-wetting. Along with your minister and the national parks, we've done 6,000 hectares working together on certain bogs. But when they come into the field, I'll tell you one thing, it'll be a different story, and that's one thing sure. I think there's the pressure that's on as well, Minister, and this should be recognised, and I'm not saying it's your fault. The pressure that's on is that you've increased the rates, and that has to be acknowledged. There's no one going saying that hasn't happened. But also the rates for the bit of land that the dairymen, I was talking to a person this morning, I was in Limerick this morning, and I was talking to a person that was farming in Tipperary, and they were telling me that to rent an acre of land now in Tipperary could be 450 an acre. So that's 450 and 450 and half, it is 225. It's about 1,200 an acre, and your land isn't tied up. You can decide after 4 or 5 years what you do. I'm not saying it's your fault, but that's the pressure that's going on in different parts of the country for land, and is problematic. The one part that is causing problems, Minister, and I think your department needs to nip this at the bud, is that there is a lot of speculation out there about Coillte going with this investment company. Why don't they go to the EIB if they're going to buy in land and buy it? Why don't they get the funding there? They're going with an investment company in England. What we're hearing, and let them contradict it if we're wrong, that there's a special purpose vehicle going to be introduced, that company will draw the premiums, which Coillte never done before, but that they will go in then ploughing out bits of land, small farms where a farmer might be trying to be viable and buy 5 or 10 acres, they'll just make it unworkable. And I think if that starts, then there's an awful battle going to happen in rural Ireland, and I think it's your department that can nip that at the bud. In fairness to you, over the last 2 years, the forestry licences, and I know Coillte had an advantage on it, but the forestry licences have improved well. You know, I will acknowledge that. But you talk about 8,000 hectares, and you said we have it sort of, we're flying it now at it. Well, the facts are that we have about 4,500. Let's go to 5,000 hectares of forestry licences granted this year, of planting licences granted this year. And let's multiply that by 2 is 10,000 hectares, and let's multiply it by 2.5. Because if you're going to plant 8,000 hectares, you have to give out about 12,000 hectares in licences, because a third will never go back into it. That's the reality. And if you're at your damnedest at the moment getting out 5,000, how are we going to magically get to 12,000 to make sure that we'll be able to plant 8,000 hectares with the fall off of what has happened? And some of it at the moment, there's a reason behind it, Minister, because they went to glass or they go to acres, because if you're waiting 2 or 3 years, that's the reason why, because the bad taste in farmers' mouth. I know there's new grants there. I appreciate that part of it. But there is solutions. But if we're going to be picky about it, I think there's a solution, and I think a lot of farmers will buy into it. And I know there's going to be a scheme, the 1 hectare, that if you sow broadleaves, but even if you got every farmer to encourage them to sow an acre, you'd get 130,000 acres sown in one shot, like that. And to be about 7 or 8 years of what your target is. It'll tick the box for you, but it won't solve the problem for the planting of, basically, we still need planting for the timber industry, because you can't just run away from it. And on top of that, the figures that were given out earlier on, I'm listening to figures about what trees will absorb and what they're putting out, what bog will absorb or peat and what will put out, what land will do and what it won't do. And what we have gone, and everyone needs to know, is we're on default figures, because in fairness to Teagasc, they've now started doing the research, and the initial results look positive, that what the estimates were or what the default position was, it's a good bit less in relation to emissions and all that. And even a cow, where everyone was kicking around the place not too long ago, it looks like it could be 20% less the emissions, which will change a lot of the ball game. But there's an awful fight for different sectors at the moment, and that's where the pressure is going to come on.